Hi, everyone. My name is Susanne Kallanian, and I'm an inner leadership coach. And welcome to my video cast. And here with me today is James Priest. James is a co-developer of Sociocracy 3.0. And James will talk a little bit about the concept, and we will dive a little bit deeper into the relationship, or more so this interface between inner development, organizational development, and yeah, we'll just see where the conversation leads us. And James, you have quite extensive experience in holistic organizational development. And before you talk a little bit more about your own path, I want to jump right into the subject, and so that our listeners can understand what is Sociocracy 3.0. And for me personally, as a coach, I'm interested in, of course, the personal development of leaders, of employees. But what also drives me is looking at the whole work environment and how we define work and how we are or have been trying to find new words to work. So in the German-speaking world, as I already explained to you before, we have this term new work, which basically entails that we want to find ways of working that put the person, us as humans, at the center. Yeah, that we want to develop our potential, that we want to work and enjoy what we do and find what we really, really want to do. And I don't know if you know, but the father of new work, Fridtjof Bergman, passed away recently. And so this is also a little bit of a in memoriam of him and finding ways of developing and creating a working world that has values more centered about human beings. And as I always really want to emphasize, also our planet, because the way we have been operating, exploiting our planet. And yeah, I think the direction we were headed is really not one that I would like to continue going. And I have children, and I want to think about the future and the next generations. And long story short, we need to find new ways of collaborating. And I find Sociocracy a great way, and Sociocracy offers great tools and patterns to implement that in organizations and in our system. So James, if you can just briefly describe the concept of Sociocracy to us.
Sure. Well, the concept was first conceived of by Auguste Comte in the 1850s. And he coined the term sociocracy as a name for what he foresaw as a necessary and inevitable future form of government within states that would take a more empirical approach to how governance was handled. He was a positivist philosopher. He also coined the term sociology, or at least he's attributed for doing so. I think it was someone earlier who first came up with that term. So he was really an advocate for science and the scientific method. And he also anticipated in the future that states would be governed with large influence from the social scientists, the sociologists. Some people talk about Comte having a good era and a bad era, like good Comte, bad Comte. And certainly people took his ideas in many different ways. And I don't think all of those were translated in a manner that would be aligned towards what you were sharing about in terms of a world where, you know, we work together towards the well-being of people and planet. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, I think he wasn't far wrong in the fact that we saw this evolution from a more feudal fundamentalist way of governing towards a more scientific, reasoned way of making and evolving agreements together. And he did also advocate for the necessity of participation of the people in the governance. It takes much less energy to work together than it does to try to control a majority of people to achieve your ends. You know? So another way to think about sociocracy, though, is to go to the root of the meaning of the word, which basically translates as rule by the social group. So democracy is rule by the demos, rule by those with voting privilege. Lester Frank Ward took some of Comte's ideas and was very big on diving into what this would look like, societies where the social groups themselves take responsibility for governance. which I suppose in a healthy democratic republic is kind of the idea, you know, a representative democracy somehow. But nonetheless, ultimately, it's about the people. So I'm saying that because it's helpful to understand sociocracy at that level, because these days we've got the Sociocratic circle method developed by Endenburg from the 70s in the Netherlands. We've got spin-offs from that, including holacracy, which, as you say, has quite a lot of traction there in Austria, or at least, you know, people are aware of holacracy, which was very much influenced by the Sociocratic circle method, actually, and then S3. And so holacracy and the Sociocratic circle method are they're frameworks, basically. Well, the Sociocratic circle method is a methodology for governance in organizations, and holacracy is a framework for organizations that handles beyond governance. It's also designed to support people to handle operations as well, and to reposition power in a system to be in service of the purpose of the organization itself. And maybe that's something we come to in this conversation, because there is this balance, right, between the individual and the organization. And so, you know, sometimes people lay themselves down on the line in service of something greater than themselves. So organizations that indulge every individual as the purpose and priority, well, that's ideally a community, and you still need to draw some lines. But organizations exist to serve purpose. And so this question of how we strike a balance between the needs of the individual and the intent of the organization itself, how we choose wisely who participates in which organizational system, why and when, are key questions that we need to answer. Yeah, so maybe I'll leave it there for a moment. And
so the way I understand it, and you've explained a little bit about the method of governance and the question in general, how, you know, we come to these, how do we govern ourselves? How do we govern, or how do we, you know, run our organizations? And this term of using, you know, the wisdom of all, the collective intelligence is in a way behind that. You know, it's we are much smarter together than just one individual making decisions. So this participatory process, and also getting the best out of collaboration. So I think this is where S3 offers patterns and methods to bring that out in an organization, you know, because we want to, in the end, be successful. And you mentioned purpose. We are, you know, every organization has a purpose. And I think, is that what you call also drivers in S3? Is that comparable to purpose, or is that different? If I may ask that now, because for clarification.
Yeah, well, there's an interrelationship. So purpose gets a little bit kind of misconstrued, I think, these days. You know, there's many interpretations of it, and some of them can get a little bit fluffy. But if you look in the dictionary at what purpose is about, it's the reason why you do something.
Right.
Right. So driver is a concept from S3. It's the why. It's a there's more to it than first meets the eye, because when an individual or a group of people are motivated to act in some way, it's because somebody is perceiving a situation occurring in a certain context where things are different to what that person would expect or wish to see. And in their own minds, they've prioritized that situation against other situations that may be different to what they expect or wish to see, and are motivated to interact with it in some way, either to preserve something or to change something, because they anticipate that a different now in the immediate future would be better than the one that they see today. So that's kind of at the heart of what motivates us to act. So, you know, you're speaking about how you value the prospect of organizations becoming more human-centric and world-conscious, you know, and expanding our scope of attention beyond the now to consider the impact of our actions across time, both locally and also globally as well. So that motivates you, it's meaningful for you, and then you invest your energy in moving in that direction. So you could say your purpose is to, well, you could say it any way you like, right? Create a better world, or contribute towards the evolution of a more conscious humanity or whatever it might be. But the driver is that situation that you are perceiving, and there's a relationship between you as perceiver and the perceived, and meaning making that takes place in that, and a decision somehow, whether that's more or less conscious, that to interact in some way and to exercise your power to influence in a way that would facilitate change or preserve something precious. So it's a geeky answer, I know, but that's
but it's an interesting little distinction. And what I like too, you have I watched a little video where you very nicely explain the concept of S3, and you also say in there that learning about S3 helps you discover more about yourself. So as an inner leadership coach, of course, I'm always interested in this inner development and going back to new forms of governing our organization that are more collaborative, where we also, as each one has to, bring more responsibility and show up really as a whole person. This inner development is key. And what you say is that the patterns that are employed with S3 help you to become increasingly aware of who you are and what your patterns are. And maybe let's talk a little bit more about that. So when this interface happens between, okay, now I'm becoming aware of a pattern I have, and now I'm trying something new with S3. How can you give us some example of methods or concrete situations where this might happen? So
yeah. Well, okay. So at the interface between the habitual and the new, the potential for greater consciousness resides. So if everything appears as it should be, then generally we go about our day pretty automatically, unconsciously, and as it should be, because if we had to think everything through consciously and intentionally all the time, we wouldn't get very far at all. So, we're deeply habituated into ways of interacting in the world. I like to acknowledge the fact that we're all born unique. I've never met another me, for sure. So there's not a nature-nurture question here. It's both are relevant. But, we're born with our nature, epigenetics, right, and so on. And then we arrive into the environment, and we need to, the system is set up to adjust to meet whatever the expectations are as best as possible, to endeavor to preserve our lives and to live as long and pain-free a life as possible. It's something like this for most people. I mean, sometimes people decide that opting out of life would be a less challenging path than otherwise. But generally speaking, life wants to live somehow, and we do. So there's some kind of compromise there on the part of the psyche, and that's part of childhood development, right? We're socialized, and we collude with that to socialize ourselves. So let's assume in a perfect world, we all grew up exactly as we needed to be to orientate through this amazing place in a manner where everything turned out just as it should. Well, you could argue there would be no need for consciousness at that point. I like what I heard Jordan Peterson say, that consciousness is an error detect and rectification system. And I kind of like that, because it's like, if everything looks fine, it's fine. But if it's not, you really want to know that it's not. Or if there's an opportunity, I don't know, nice fruit on a tree, you really want to be motivated somehow to move toward that. Or if there's some kind of obstacle, you want to get it out of the way or get away from it, and so on, right? So the point is that we all grow up in different environments, and no matter how idyllic, which obviously for most of us it was nothing like idyllic, our childhoods are, we're continuously bumping into new environments and new contexts. And so by the time we arrive in an organization or some kind of collaborative context, I mean, a classroom in school is the same problem, right? We bump into people who have identified with behaviors connected to values that might be very different to some of our own. And herein lies like the fundamental challenge for us as human beings in relationship, because at that binary level, we tend to polarize. We identify with certain people, and we tend to polarize with others. You're like me, you're not like me.
Yeah.
You're good, you're bad. And it's really that low resolution sometimes. So we've got this combination of habitual behaviors in terms of how we interact with our environment, but also internal behaviors that reflect internal values that define for us who we want to be with and how, and whom we don't. So let's roll forward to an organizational context and paint that idyllic picture. Everything's exactly as it should be. We're all just working together in the flow, creating value, and everything's wonderful, right? Only it's not, because there are inner challenges in ourselves, in conflict with what's happening between us as each other, and also in terms of our objectives as an organization, what motivates us, the organization itself, and trying to orientate in an ever-changing and complex world. So one of the things that concerns me is that we have a tendency to look outside of ourselves for the answer.
Right.
And so, thank you to our ancestors who went through horrific experiences to be able to pass on some of the wisdom that we have the privilege of inheriting as a generation today. But it's not enough, right? Because life is ever changing, the world's ever changing. So we have to continuously develop new ways as well. So this tendency to look outside of ourselves for the answer is a good thing, in the sense that we can be inspired by and learn from others, but we can also project onto things as being solutions, and they're not really high resolution enough or precisely what we would need. And so the bigger something is, like a big framework for an organization, for example, a whole system change, the more chance there is that a number of micro aspects of that framework will be inappropriate to suit the need. So the question is, what's the need, right? Where exactly is it that things, despite our best efforts, are not good enough right now, fail to bring about the results we expect or wish to see? And we're willing to put in the effort to attempt to interact with that situation in a new way, right? We're going to, because at that moment, there's this recognition of, okay, everything I've learned, all I've become, for whatever reason, is just not good enough to deal with this situation. So I'm going to look outside of myself to see, is this an alternative? And in that moment of acknowledgement, there's a potential for some disidentification with those habitual ways of doing things. I might never have thought about how I position myself in a decision-making process with others until it doesn't work anymore. And it matters so much to me that it doesn't work, that I can acknowledge the limitation, the inadequacy of my approach. So, yeah. So generally people don't consider change consciously until it's just so damn difficult and things didn't work out well enough.
Right. Until we hit a wall.
Yeah. And of course, it doesn't have to be like that, because we can learn that that's the way the system goes. And so we can preempt that and be more open to seeing those subtle signs that something in ourselves is just banging up against the world in a way that doesn't really work. So anyway, that's a very long way of arriving at a pattern-based approach to change. So S3, from one perspective, is a menu of human behavior patterns. Concrete ones, some of them, like ways for making and evolving agreements, ways for collaboratively deciding on things, for organizing work, for prioritizing, and for supporting one another to develop and learn, and so on. But they're patterns intended for that moment when an individual or a group says, okay, hands up, it's not good enough what we're doing right now. What else might there be out there we can consider? And not with the intent that you sell these patterns to people, but more that people, by their own volition, take them and unpack them and experiment a bit with them, and maybe even say, okay, let's commit to play the game like this for a while. So when vulnerable and the pull to exercise those habitual behaviors is that it's most strong, there's some constraints in place that they intentionally wish to be bound by somehow, to enable them to experiment with discovering a new way. And that's what I mean by that interface between the habitual and the new. The potential for consciousness resides, and why it's so fundamentally important. It's at the heart of humanism, right? A humanistic approach to personal development and transformation, it
Yeah.
has to come from the volition of the self. Yeah.
Yes, I love that, because I think this is something that, you know, when I was in my jobs before, or if I think of the working world in general, whoever really talks about that, how important it is, you know, what you bring yourself, like your inner self, and this, you know, self-development as being a big part, you know, of your job and your work environment, and not, okay, here's what you have to do it, and then do that for 20 years or 30 years and never really have the chance to develop. So I think bringing that in, you know, saying that, you know, we have methods where we can then just, you know, first of all, people thrive, people develop, and my organization benefits. So I think what it also needs, as you said, I mean, we need to be there, self-aware. And I mean, when you work in organizations, when you come in, I mean, what I also like about your concept of S3 is that you say there isn't one size fits all, and you start where you are and you pick one area where you feel you need to start changing some patterns because it's not working. So I think this is also something that makes totally sense. And then, you know, it's not something that you bring from the outside in and say, okay, we're going to change our structures and here it is and everybody needs to do it. But you start where maybe these challenges are, where you feel you're not moving forward. And that's when you come in. So I think it can grow more organically and people are more involved. Is that, do I understand that correctly with your approach?
Yeah. And there's no right way, right? I'm not advocating for one way or the other. So there are certainly cases where some big system-wide implementation of a whole bunch of new constraints in the system has turned out okay for people. It's less likely the more that it's going to turn out to the degree where the gains outweigh the costs somehow. And so, you know, I'm going to try and take a big leap here, and you can pull me back to where we are if I go too far off the rails. But I'm thinking, so we exchanged a little bit through LinkedIn before this call, and I shared a link to you around voice dialogue and psychology of selves. And, you know, essentially it's this inquiry based upon the presupposition that the psyche is multiple. You know, and if you go back to my example of identifying with certain behaviors, you could say we also disown certain behaviors. You know, I want to be less like that and more like this, but we can't escape our deeper nature. And, you know, when I read your literature, you're saying it's about really like daring to be ourselves somehow. And when we say ourselves, it's like all of the different aspects of ourselves. Like, how do I expand myself to embrace my inner organization, this world of contradictions, where for every position I can take, there's a equal and polarized position that I could take, like mind and body. You know, it's like doing and being. It's like these are two ends of poles, and we can position ourselves somewhere between those two ends and kind of have a unique experience on the basis of wherever that equilibrium lies. So anyway, let me see, what was my point here around this? Yeah, so in my work as a voice dialogue facilitator, which I'm not practicing as a voice dialogue facilitator these days, but what attracted me to it in the first instance 20 years ago when I first experienced it was the humanistic nature of it, because the role of a voice dialogue facilitator is to, let's say we're in a client facilitator context, is to meet the client wherever they are. So somebody shows up and says, oh, hey, I'm interested in voice dialogue. As a facilitator, I'm listening to the self in the client who's interested in voice dialogue. I'm not buying it that the whole of that person is interested in voice dialogue, but there's definitely a part that's interested in it. And if they say, and I say why, and they say, well, I'm really curious about how all this works. I've been thinking about myself and my relationships. So voice dialogue is about identifying these parts and at some point checking out, would you be willing to just move over a bit? We'll carry on this conversation. The idea being we're going to give a space and create some awareness of this part. So as the facilitator, I have awareness of it. Maybe the client has never been aware of it, but by giving space and allowing this part to speak, then suddenly the lights are on. Okay. And at some point that the energy of that will dissipate, and then you can move the client back to where they came from and say, hey, this part of you is really into voice dialogue and got you here to the session today, you know? And so it's like peeling off layers of the onion. But
yeah,
in the 60s and 70s especially, there was this kind of horrific practice of, oh, you feel like a timid mouse, so come to this roar like a lion workshop for a few days, you know? And people would come and roar like lions for a few days. They go back into their environment that was entirely set up for them to behave like a mouse and collapse, right?
Yeah.
Because they just weren't, the system wasn't ready. You need the mouse on board, right? You need the mouse and the vulnerability that being like a mouse protects in consciousness and embraced in a more conscious way before it's a good idea to go roaring like a lion, you know? So anyway, my point is that I don't want to draw a direct parallel, but when it comes to organizations, it's the same. It's like, who am I to say how an organization should change? It's an extremely complex system, you know, and the moment you start poking around in it, you're going to change that whole system in some way. Just suggesting that you're going to poke around in it will change the whole system in some way already. So what's showing up? What's on top? What's acknowledged? Who's coming forward? Who's questioning things as they are? Who's looking at possibilities? And how do you start there? Because it gives you this much more organic, iterative approach to change, and you don't mess so many things up in one go. So then you can deal with all the unintended consequences more effectively, because there's less of them than there would be if you suddenly change the system as a whole.
And let's face it, I mean, change is also something that by nature, we're often like, oh, change, you know, we want to resist it too, you know? And so I think it's very wise to just come in and, as you said, with the mouse and the lion example too, meet the mouse where the mouse is at and take it a next step, you know, maybe to become a, you know, house cat first before a big roaring lion. So you can, you know, it's like an organic, natural development. So with the self and the organization. And I think this is where it's always this, as I call it before, a dance, you know, you kind of go, you have to meet each other all the time and then take it the next step, you know, just like with our own level of consciousness, just take it step by step. And when you go into organizations, you know, you meet them where they're at and you see, you know, what, you know, is like one next step they can take. So
well, and before that, let's get to know the mouse. Let's get to know the mouse. Let's look at all the value that behavior brings you, right? Because it's often, you know, if we take the individual example, it's like this, the other side is starting to come through. They're like this damn mouse. It's like every time I try to speak up, I suddenly collapse again. And, you know, and so there can be an impulse within the individual to want to change things, but they don't have the infrastructure in place for that to be sustainable, right? So, but inviting a backup and say, okay, that sounds like there's definitely motivation to move. But before we do, let's look at what you're doing already. Let's look at the mouse. Let's honor the value in that so that we don't throw it out, because you're going to need that mouse, like 100%. Yeah. And so that it's awareness is the precursor to change. It doesn't facilitate change in itself. I'm aware I'm acting like a mouse and I still act like a mouse, but it's a start, and honoring the mouse, to burn this metaphor to death, you know, enables more inquiry into what that takes care of, and increases the chances of disidentification, and sort of moves energetically on the pole away from mouse towards lion. It's like, that's kind of how it works.
Exactly. I like that metaphor with the
yeah, but let's drop it now.
James, I'm very curious, and I'm sure our listeners are too, about your own path to this, you know, becoming the co-developer of S3. What was your, maybe you can give us a little bit of a, you know, a little bit overview of your path. How did you get here, and what, you know, what drives you to keep doing what you're doing?
Well, definitely, I used to use metaphors like mouse and lion a lot more than I do these days. These days, it's more about challenges in organizations and people aspiring towards being more agile and responsive and so on. So, well, I think my life pre 26 is less relevant to this conversation, but around mid-20s, I had a bit of an epiphany when I discovered voice dialogue. What was more interesting to me was the psychology of selves and aware ego process. It was like the lights came on, that's why that person pisses me off so much. It's like there's a part of me that has a very strong position that perceives that as opposite. And I learned at some point in my life that wasn't acceptable to honor in me, and so I've identified with this side, dismissed that side, and now life keeps bringing me all these people that piss me off. I thought that was just that life sucks, but actually it's quite clever because it's continuously giving me this opportunity to reintegrate things that I'd lost along the way. So anyway, parts of me thought it was a really powerful frame to have to be able to orientate better in the world, and underestimated just how transformational it would be for me personally, because I literally unraveled myself over a few years. I was privileged in that I could indulge myself in this kind of exploration. I had a ton of sessions over 4 years or so. I got involved in a 3-year training that was starting up in the UK. I dived into integrative counseling just to learn some other modalities and started to put all of this together in some way. And most fundamentally at that time, I had a realization that being entrepreneurial was not my thing, but listening for life's invitation and orientating according to where there was a fit between what was meaningful for me and where I felt I could serve was how I wanted to kind of orientate through life. So I've kind of been doing that ever since, and just ended up by chance co-developer of Sociocracy 3.0 these days. But just to make a bridge between that experience and Sociocracy, I was introduced to the Sociocratic circle method in 2001, working with a community in conflict. And I was very interested at that time on how to facilitate processes that would transform conflict into opportunities to learn and grow, using this kind of basic principle of judgment as torchlight that emphasizes what we disown. And the person who had kind of sponsored me to step in and work with this community was experienced MVC trainer, but also had heard, nonviolent communication, and also heard about Sociocracy. So she said, look, I'd like you to work with these people, but please learn about Sociocracy and MVC. And I heard those two terms in the same sentence. I knew about MVC, but I was like, what is that, Anyway, there's a lot to say about Sociocracy, but one aspect of it is the consent decision-making process. Mm-hmm. And consent decision-making, what struck me about it was, through mutual intent, a group of people come together to respond to a driver that requires some kind of response, somehow, a situation where they agree something needs to happen. They need to arrive at a decision collaboratively around that, because it's going to affect them all. And rather than descending into a binary kind of fight of whoever shouts loudest, whoever can lobby hardest, and so on, their idea is going to win, and we can test it with majority decision making, where new wisdom emerging through the minority is always lost, because the majority don't wake up one day enlightened. It's always the crazy person on the periphery who sees something new first. Yeah. Consent decision making was saying, hold the tension between apparent opposites in relation to a clear why, and then follow this process to extract the essential value of these different positions and points of view to arrive at a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. And I thought that was so amazing, because that was a reflection of the inner work of voice dialogue and developing a aware ego process, like learning to integrate these apparently irreconcilable opposites, hold the tension there, and to arrive at a place where, for most people, choice is, I've got to make a choice, right? But from aware ego process, choice is realization. It's just now I'll do this, because there's a sense of timing and rightness,
That's true. Yeah.
And so consent decision making, it's much more than just a process to follow. If you really get deep into the potentiality of that, it's creating a field through shared intent to transcend the binary world and arrive at, well, we say both and more consciousness, or Rumi says beyond right wrongdoing, there's a field, I'll meet you there. It's not that everybody's right, but there's grains of rightness distributed among people, and we bring that together to harness collective intelligence and make smarter decisions than we can alone. So that's the bridge, from psychology of selves to sociocracy. And I just thought, this is cool. I think I should probably do something with this for the rest of my life. So
yeah, it works well together. So you now mainly work, although we've talked a lot now about psychology, inner development, but you work as an organizational consultant in a way, supporting organizations, teams to become more collaborative. And so maybe if let's say I want to, work with you on like a project or something. So you work internationally, right? Also, or So can you explain a little bit that process? Because I know, because I want to just kind of finish up now with the organizational part again, going from the, inner to the, how do you actually, support and help that process of, do you do trainings? Do you work with individuals? Can you explain a little bit that process of how you actually support organizations?
Yeah, well, just as a preface, so I consider myself an ex-consultant in the field of Sociocracy 3.0, at least, because I think that, and there's a caveat to this, that sometimes, occasionally, sharing advice with the recommendation, it's just my perspective, what I would do. I'm not saying you do it, right? But I think in general, consultancy is an anti-pattern towards self-organization. I see myself more as somebody who wants to catalyze situations where people learn how to better help themselves. So in that sense, I'm a teacher, I'm a learning facilitator, I'm a mentor, I'm a coach sometimes, and maybe occasionally I consult. So when people come to me, individuals or groups in organizations, and say, because typically they don't say, hey, look, we've got this challenge and can you help? They say, hey, we're interested in learning about S3. So my first question always in that case is, why ever do you want to do that? Why haven't you got enough on already? Why are you looking to S3 as something that you think might be useful? And that in itself can separate the wheat from the chaff sometimes, because sometimes people say, oh, we're just, because I don't know, because it's cool. And that's definitely not a reason.
But there's something behind that.
yeah. But my point is it's helping people to get out of projecting onto S3 as something they're going to love or hate, and instead to come back to that deeper question: what motivated me to make this call to begin with? What motivated me to reach out to begin with? And I've had many conversations with senior people in organizations where, at the end of an hour's sense-making conversation around their situation, I know that's the last I'm going to hear of them for quite a while, because they weren't really clear on not what the source of the problem is, because in complexity, there's like a myriad of sources to the problem, right?
Yeah.
But just clarity around the situation somehow. So that's a starting point in S3, generally speaking, and it's my starting point as well. But the primary interest I have these days is helping people to learn, people who want to learn about alternatives that can enrich, complement all of the wonderful things that they've learned to do already, and supporting them to just holding space where, when they do turn around and realize, oh my God, I'm like 99% of my problem here. To help them meet themselves in a compassionate way, via that reassurance. Hey, there's a good reason why you did that. I agree, it's a really bad way of handling this situation, but cut yourself some slack, because There's probably a good reason. I don't know, when you were 6 or something, that made sense, and you've perhaps got away with it ever since. So to be more concrete, it's really about delivering learning interventions. We work with individuals who come from organizations into public programs that we run. We run internal programs, but primarily it's around facilitating learning around understanding S3 on different levels, like the more time we have with people, the more we can support them to go deep and get more into some of what we talked about today. But at the very least, just learning about some new patterns, why they're the way they are, giving them experience of applying those, and then offering some sort of mentoring over time where they experiment with that and bump into challenges and help them to make sense of it along the way. So we're moving towards a new kind of strategy, which has emerged through need, which is really about, so in larger organizations, it doesn't make sense that the majority of people invest some days in learning about something like S3, and anyway, that's just not affordable. But so we're developing micro learning as well, and we're working at, like 2-3 minute daily dose of something highly relevant to context with actionable element at the end.
Videos or emails or
video and text and so it's really like I want to get out of my own way or out of other people's way as soon as possible. And these days we emphasize more the need for an investment in learning. Organizations do need to develop internal expertise. I think, that don't be dependent on external experts if you can help it. So my interest is in kind of supporting others to support others to support themselves.
Great. That sounds great. And just to sum up with the training part or this micro training, I like that concept because, or micro learning, micro training, because I often feel organizations, send their employees to a 2-day or 4-day training or leadership training, and they think, okay, that's it, check, now they've got it, when it's a process and you kind of need constant facilitation or mentoring, or we have a great term in German, Begleitung, it means kind of like hand holding along the way a little bit until you are, settled in it. And I like that idea that you're offering this, and I understand it more a little bit as this, okay, let's, I walk with you for a while and then I let you go once you're ready. So I think this is a great concept, and
to help people understand that learning processes take time, and habitual behaviors, just because you realize it's outworn or no longer useful in a certain context doesn't mean to say it's going to change. And the more vulnerable, the more pressure there is somehow, the more inclined we're going to fall back on behaviors, even if they are dysfunctional. So you're right. It's like repetition, fall down. Oh, I did it again, pick myself up, try again. That takes time. And we used to run 3-day intensive programs with people, and they were great, and people moved and transformed. But if you do the research around retention and integration of learning outcomes, it's like 15%, 20%. It might be useful, but there's a whole bunch of misinterpretation and misunderstanding as well. And people just take things through the lens of their current paradigm and come up with some really interesting interpretations of things. So,
well, that, and plus then it's all great at the training, and then you go back into the system and it's kind of like, how do I apply this now? Or, this is kind of what I meant. So that
exactly.
Have somebody along the way who helps you implement the change, because that's what in the end is the hardest, is to implement. I mean, we might be aware of it, but implementing the change is where we often fail. I hate to say it, but I know it myself. It's the implementation, the doing part, the getting on my mat every day and not slacking. So that's it. So learning as a process and change as a process. I think that's in a way how I want to end our nice talk here. I think we could keep talking on and on. And what I realize is that inner leadership, the way I understand this, is very much how you define it and how you have lived it and how you are teaching it. So I think this bringing that back to, the center, that we are humans, we want to develop, and that's really at the core of everything is us as humans and the development and what we want to bring to this world and how we want to leave it. So thank you so much, James.
Pleasure. Susanne, can I say one thing on that? Because before the call, I was thinking about this, and
yeah,
it's clumsy probably because I haven't thought about it in quite this way before, but I was thinking about inner leadership, and I was thinking about this process I was describing of developing more aware ego process, more integration, or it's expanding myself to embrace these different aspects of myself somehow, and hold the quarrels that might happen between them. And then I was thinking about this move toward more decentralized authority within systems. And I was reflecting on this kind of parallel, because when people think about leadership, they often think about somebody who stands up and leads the way, and leadership is influence, so somebody who influences. And these days you also see the emergence of a appreciation for facilitative leadership. It's like just a block from Bertzold. I really liked his approach. He was telling me, James, when somebody comes and asks me what they should do, I ask them, what do you need to support you to learn what you need to do, right? That's a kind of facilitative leader. And what he's doing is he's giving maximal opportunity for all of those different aspects of the system, like the people, to be able to develop in whatever ways they need, to do their unique thing, to bring their unique value somehow. And so in terms of inner leadership and leadership within organizations as well, I think there's some crossover there, and it's important to recognize that inner leadership is about integration of a diverse, it's like a community of parts of ourselves working together in a manner where they can synergize that contribution in a way maximally to enable creation of value in whichever way we define it. And it's the same in organizations. And I believe that there is, I'm not saying it's an exact parallel, but I think that's an interesting perspective to end on.
Yes.
What does it look like, organizations where we learn to dance together, to get beyond this idea of right, wrong, and polarizing, down ideological lines, to be able to take a more nuanced, sophisticated, high resolution sweep on that and really benefit from the potential that the collective intelligence can provide. Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway.
Thank you. That was a beautiful little ending and summary of our conversation, and how I understand inner leadership and how it does, it's anything that happens within us also happens on the outside, and you can always draw these parallels, and that's a wonderful way to end this. And I thank you so much, James, for your time and this wonderful talk. And I wish you all the best with your endeavors and your work. You're doing great work, and keep on mentoring and keep on teaching and keep on bringing collaboration to organizations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity, and for indulging me in thinking through some new things too.
You're very welcome.